to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
And welcome to The Law Show on CL 650. Today joining us, Joe Murphy Q.C. lawyer at Murphy Battista, and Mike Murphy from Murphy Battista in downtown Vancouver. We touched on already in the show the Provincial Court, Small Claims Court, British Columbia Supreme Court. We're going to touch on the Court of Appeal and the BC Residential Tenancy Office. Now, to both of you, when you go into a courtroom, how different is it from what we see on TV and in the movies? So when you're going in, you go to trial. Most people only ever hopefully get to court for a traffic, to basically fight a speeding ticket or something like that. And that's really all we ever get to see. So how different is it?
Well, Zach, one of the big differences in Canada and in BC is in Supreme Court or Court of Appeal, lawyers wear their gowns. The gowns and the special tabs and that. And
you don't wear the wigs?
No. In England, they still wear the wigs, but I can't imagine on a hot day with a tough case putting on essentially a toque to run a case.
So what do you know the history behind all this?
The history behind it is to make the lawyers all look the same. So it's what they say or do that counts. And it's sort of like the same idea behind uniforms in private schools. You want to get away from what they're wearing making a difference. So
the guy with the $7,000 suit on.
I gave a lecture to a large group of lawyers years ago in Washington, D.C., and to give that lecture, these were essentially American lawyers, I wore my gowns. And they were absolutely fascinated. They thought, wow, would we ever like something like that? Because, you can get a little dramatic or more dramatic with gowns than you can with a suit on. But there's that. The decorum in a Canadian court is far more respectful and reserved than it is in a U.S. court.
No cameras in the courtroom? For the most part?
Almost never. But the other big difference between the Canadian courtroom and a U.S. courtroom is that most U.S. judges are elected and all Canadian judges are appointed.
I find that so interesting because you can really skew, you elect the sheriff, you elect the county judge. It just seems like there's so much can go wrong with that.
Well, what I think the problem with electing judges is twofold. Number one, when they campaign for re-election or election, they've got to go out and ask people for money. They've got to go out and get people's support, and they get their support by telling these people what those people want to hear. When it gets time to sitting on cases, if a case comes in front of a judge where it involves someone who was a major donor in their campaign, or involves a case where there's strong public interest about this case, is that going to influence the judge's decision? Is a judge who believes someone should be acquitted of a serious criminal offense going to be influenced by how the community would feel if he found them not guilty? And there was recently a case in the States that went to the federal appeal court. It had previously been dealt with by a trial judge in California and in California Supreme Court. And the federal judge hearing this case, who was appointed by the government, said in remarking what the judges below had done, maybe that's what happens when you have to elect judges. Because in that case, the California Court of Appeal had made a decision that I found shocking, saying, well, this really doesn't matter. And the federal court was aghast at not only what had happened, but how the three judges in the California Supreme Court had dealt with it.
So in Canada, how do judges get called to the bench?
The federal government appoints Court of Appeal judges and Supreme Court judges. The provincial government appoints provincial court judges. They're appointed for life with mandatory retirement at age 75.
Are they nominated by other lawyers?
No, they put their name in. If you're interested, you write a letter to the system and you say, I'm interested in being a judge. There's then a very detailed vetting process to determine whether someone's suitable to be a judge. And if they're suitable, they're considered by a very private committee made up of judges and lawyers that decide whether this would be a good choice. It's interesting, Zach, because while Stephen Harper was in power, he appointed a bunch of judges to a variety of levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada. And later, when these judges came out with a judgment that wasn't at all popular with the federal government, some people said, well, this shows you when you appoint a judge for life, they get to freely decide what the right decision is, as opposed to being influenced by who got them there and who's going to reelect them. So it's a much, much better system in Canada.
And the gowns are more dramatic.
Oh, yeah.
So when you have a situation where you get a judgment and you appeal it, does it go back to the Supreme Court or is it a separate court?
It goes to the Court of Appeal. It goes before a panel of at least 3 judges. And the only evidence they hear is the evidence that was heard at trial. So there's a transcript of everything done at trial. There's copies of all the exhibits. And you have to show, to succeed in the Court of Appeal, you have to show that the trial judge didn't, if you're trying to retain the judgment, that the trial judge didn't make any significant errors. So it's up for the Court of Appeal to look for errors made by the judge as opposed to retrying the facts.
Now, Mike, we always think that as a layperson that you're actually doing a whole retrial, but you're not really. You're just putting forward the evidence that was brought to the original case.
Yes.
And pointing out maybe where you think the judgment was wrong. Is that basically how it works?
That's correct. You'd want to do your best to point out if there's errors in law, which are sometimes fairly obvious. I was mentioning earlier that the judgments can be quite lengthy. In many cases, they deal with a whole bunch of different points of law, and it's very easy to either misstate what the correct law is or come to a conclusion that may not be exactly on point. You'd want to point that out. The appeal process is quite different. In many cases, you'd want to hire a lawyer that specializes in appeals because they're able to see things in a different light.
Because as a layperson, I thought when you had an appeal, you're basically redoing it all again, but that's not the case.
No. Exactly. It's a really interesting process when there's a criminal case with a jury and the jury convicts or acquits, and then the Court of Appeals has to look at it, because if they find that one of the paragraphs in the judge's charge to the jury at the end of the trial, where the judge says to the jury, this is how you should go about making your decision, if one paragraph is wrong, and maybe there's 200 paragraphs, there's a good chance they will order a new trial. So you can have a criminal trial that lasts weeks, involves a multitude of witnesses, but if the judge in one paragraph of a 200-paragraph charge makes a mistake, misstates the law, there's a chance that the Court of Appeal orders a new trial, and that's happened to some cases. They go back, the trial's run again, there's an appeal, they order a new trial again. So it really puts huge pressure on the trial judge in a criminal case to make sure the charge to the jury in a criminal case is almost perfect.
Now, I'm going to ask you another criminal question, even though that's not your specialty. How come in the province of British Columbia, when a petty thief or something is they try to bring charges, but it's the Crown that decides whether the charge is going to go forward? In other provinces, the police can charge somebody. They don't have to go to the Crown to get that charge laid. So why is there a difference in British Columbia?
Well, the two systems have decided to do it differently. I personally think a prosecutor should be the person who reviews the evidence and makes the decision. I think police sometimes get so involved personally in a case, they want to see a person charged. I think the better decisions are made by the prosecutor, and that's how we do it in BC. Because
the criticism on the other side is that we have a lot of petty thieves and criminals that are just at a revolving door. The police want a charge laid. The prosecutor looks at it and goes, well, he's going to get barely anything. It's just a revolving door. So the bar is set a lot higher than it would be if the police were doing it.
There are trivial offenses where the policeman writes you a ticket that you can dispute. Jaywalking. Yeah. Speeding ticket, parking ticket. I just think that the prosecutor should make the decision. The decision's usually made that the evidence isn't sufficient to assure that there's going to be a conviction. So the prosecutor has a better understanding of how the rules of evidence work and how they'd apply to that case. The reality is minor offenses are ignored. If I'm on the highway and I'm doing 15 kilometers over the limit and I'm passed by a police officer, he's not giving me a ticket. Policemen have to decide how best to sort of use their time. They don't deal with, the minor trivial offenses.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I just thought I'd ask why there's a difference. And is that the case is the British Columbia system predominantly the case across the country? Or do you know?
I don't know, but I know in Alberta there was a big furor recently by someone who was arrested by the police. They then released him on bail. He then went out and committed an awful, awful crime, whether it was multiple murders or something. And the reality is, when you looked at this guy with his criminal record, he shouldn't have been released. Mm-hmm. But it was the police on their own that did this, maybe a police and a justice of the peace. But it was a case, had it gone through the BC system, would have probably resulted in the fellow not being released. And in that case, he went out and, I believe, killed a whole bunch of people.
Terrible. Okay, we're talking about how the court system works in British Columbia, and we'll pick it up after the break right here on The Law Show.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.